Evan, a young clerk, nearly calls the police on Raymond, a silent homeless man outside his store. But when Alan, a customer, recognizes Raymond as the soldier who saved him from a burning helicopter in Vietnam, everything changes. Shocked, Evan learns Raymond was presumed dead, yet lived, haunted by war's scars. As Alan reconnects with his long-lost hero, stories of Raymond's quiet heroism surface. Who is this mysterious man? What drove him to wander alone for decades, saving others in the shadows? Uncover the truth behind Raymond's untold story and the chance encounter that changed everything. Love Raymond's incredible story? Subscribe to my channel for gripping tales of courage and redemption. Your support helps share stories that inspire. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and let's honor the unsung legends together. Respect. The fluorescent lights buzz faintly in the quiet of the Kansas convenience store, casting a sterile glow over the shelves of chips and candy bars. Evan Miller, a lanky 22-year-old with neatly combed brown hair and a perpetually earnest expression, stood behind the counter, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the register. The night shift was always a strange mix of boredom and vigilance, the hours stretching endlessly between midnight and dawn. Evan liked the solitude, though. There was something comforting about the predictable rhythm of restocking shelves and wiping down counters. He was dependable, the kind of employee who never missed a shift or forgot to lock the back door. Mrs. Pearson, his manager, had made it clear she trusted him to handle anything that came up during these quiet hours, especially when it came to the occasional homeless person who lingered too long outside the store. 6 months ago, during his training, Mrs. Pearson's voice had been firm, her eyes narrowing as she laid out the rules. If anyone hangs around for more than 15 minutes, especially those homeless types, you call the police, Evan. We can't have them scaring off customers or causing trouble. Her words had stuck with him, a constant reminder of the line between compassion and responsibility. Evan needed this job. Every paycheck went toward his community college tuition, and he couldn't afford to risk it by bending the rules. But tonight, as he glanced out the glass doors, those rules felt heavier than usual. For nearly a week now, Evan had noticed the same elderly man appearing outside the store every night around 2 a.m. Unlike the others who sometimes shuffled in, asking for spare change, or rummaged through the dumpster out back, this man kept to himself. He always sat on the curb across from the entrance, his knees drawn up slightly, clutching a faded canvas bag to his chest, like it was the only thing tethering him to the world. His eyes, pale and piercing, seemed to look through the world rather than at it, fixed on some distant memory or horizon no one else could see. There was a quiet dignity in his stillness, a refusal to beg or make a scene that set him apart from the others Evan had encountered. Tonight the weather had turned cruel. A cold drizzle fell steadily, slickening the parking lot and drumming softly against the store's windows. The temperature had plummeted, and Evan had shivered as he stepped outside earlier to drag the newspaper stand under the awning. He'd pulled his store-issued jacket tighter around his shoulders, the thin fabric doing little to keep out the chill. Yet there was the old man, sitting in his usual spot, seemingly untouched by the rain that soaked through his threadbare jacket. His gray hair clung to his scalp, but he made no move to shield himself, his hands still wrapped tightly around that worn canvas bag. "He's back again," a middle-aged customer had muttered earlier, fishing out cash for a coffee and a pack of cigarettes. The man's voice carried a mix of irritation and disdain. "You should run him off. Probably some drug addict. Bad for business, you know." Evan had nodded politely, his default response to customers who felt the need to weigh in on the store's operations. But after the man left, Evan found himself staring out at the elderly figure through the glass doors. There was something about the old man's quiet presence that stirred an uneasy feeling in Evan's chest. He wasn't loud or disruptive, didn't reek of alcohol or cause a mess. He just existed, as if the world had forgotten him, but he refused to forget himself. As the hours ticked by with no other customers, Evan's thoughts kept circling back to the man outside. The rain had grown heavier, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your joints ache. Evan couldn't imagine sitting out there hour after hour with nothing but a thin jacket and a canvas bag for comfort. He wondered what the man was thinking, what memories or sorrows kept him anchored to that curb night after night. Was he grieving, lost, or was he simply too stubborn to seek shelter? The questions gnawed at Evan, mingling with the guilt that had been building since he first noticed the man a week ago. Finally, unable to shake the feeling that he had to do something, Evan poured a cup of hot coffee from the machine behind the counter. The steam curled upward, warming his hands as he carried it outside. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped into the rain, his sneakers squelching on the wet pavement. "Sir," he called gently, approaching the man. "Would you like some coffee? It's cold out here." The old man didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Evan's presence. Up close, Evan could see the deep lines etched into his face, like a map of a life full of hardship. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, barely visible under the shadow of his stubble. His gray hair, though wet, was neatly combed, a small act of care that struck Evan as oddly poignant. The man's eyes, clear and startlingly blue, remained fixed on that invisible point in the distance. "Sir, do you need any help?" Evan tried again, holding out the coffee. His voice wavered slightly, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. The old man stayed silent, his hands never loosening their grip on the bag. After a moment, Evan retreated back inside, the coffee still warm in his hands. He set it on the counter and leaned against the register, watching the man through the window. The rain fell harder now, streaking the glass and blurring the old man's figure into a shadowy outline. Evan's stomach twisted with a mix of frustration and unease. He wanted to help, but what could he do? The man didn't want his coffee, didn't want his words, and yet the thought of calling the police felt wrong, like a betrayal of something Evan couldn't quite name. Still, Mrs. Pearson's rules echoed in his mind. He needed this job, needed the steady income to keep his dreams of a college degree live. With a heavy sigh, Evan picked up the store phone and began dialing 911. His finger hovered over the final digit, his heart pounding with indecision. Was he really going to do this? Call the police on an old man who hadn't done anything wrong except exist in the wrong place? The weight of the moment pressed down on him, his thoughts a tangle of duty, compassion, and fear of making the wrong choice. Before he could press the button, the bell above the door chimed sharply, shattering the silence. A middle-aged man in a tailored business suit hurried inside, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. "Nasty weather we're having," he remarked, his voice casual but tinged with the fatigue of a long day. Evan mumbled a vague agreement, his fingers still frozen over the keypad. The man made his way to the coffee machine, filling a large cup with quick, practiced movements. As he turned toward the register, his gaze drifted to the window, catching sight of the elderly figure outside. In an instant, everything changed. The coffee cup slipped from the man's hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Hot liquid splashed across the tiles, but he didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice. His face, moments ago composed and unremarkable, was now a mask of raw, unguarded shock. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the old man sitting in the rain, as if the world had tilted and left him grasping for balance. Evan watched, frozen, as the man's breath hitched, his hands trembling at his sides. Whatever he'd seen in that fleeting glance had undone him completely, and Evan felt the air in the store grow heavy with the weight of a story he didn't yet understand. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the convenience store's glass windows, each droplet a reminder of the world outside moving on, indifferent. Evan leaned against the counter, his fingers drumming idly as he scanned the nearly empty store. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the rows of snacks and drinks. His gaze drifted to the figure outside, an old man sitting on the curb, soaked to the bone, staring into the distance as if the rain didn't touch him. Evan's brow furrowed with a mix of curiosity and unease. He'd seen the man there every evening for the past week, always at the same time, always in that same spot, unmoving, like a statue carved from a weathered stone. His instinct had been to call the police, to report a loiterer, but something about the man's stillness held him back, a quiet plea in his silence that Evan couldn't quite name. "Sir, are you all right?" Evan called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the store as he reached for the roll of paper towels behind the counter. He stepped toward the door, expecting no response, as had been the pattern. But before he could move further, a customer, a man in his late 60s, dressed in a neatly pressed coat despite the downpour, brushed past him, his eyes locked on the figure outside. The customer's face was a storm of emotions. Disbelief, shock, and something deeper. Raw, like a wound torn open after decades of healing. He moved toward the door in a daze, his steps mechanical, as if drawn by an invisible thread. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. "That's impossible." Evan's concern deepened, his confusion sharpening into something more urgent. He followed the man, his sneakers squeaking against the tiled floor. "Sir, do you know him?" he asked, his tone gentle but laced with worry. The man turned, and Evan saw tears streaming down his face, unchecked and unashamed, carving paths through the lines of a life hard-lived. "That man," the customer said, his voice trembling with reverence and pain. "He pulled me from a burning helicopter in Vietnam. 1968, we all thought he died in the jungle 3 days later." Evan's breath caught, his hand tightening around the phone he'd been holding moments earlier. Shame washed over him, hot and heavy, as he realized how close he'd come to a grave mistake. "I was about to call the police on him," he admitted, his voice low, tinged with regret. The words felt like a confession, a betrayal of the silent figure outside. "Thank God you didn't," the man whispered, his eyes never straying from the old man in the rain. "That man saved my life, and the lives of 3 others. I've been searching for him for 50 years. One decision can change everything, you know. An entire lineage, altered by a single choice. Are you ready for that kind of weight?" The man introduced himself as Alan Briggs, a retired Marine Corps officer who now spent his days in the orderly world of insurance, a far cry from the chaos of his youth. His hands, steady despite a slight tremble, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a black and white photograph, its edges frayed but carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. "This is him," Alan said, his voice thick with emotion, as if speaking the words aloud might make the moment real. "Raymond Shaw, the day before our helicopter went down." He held the photo out to Evan, who took it with care, as if it were a sacred relic. The image showed a group of young soldiers, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, their grins defiant against the exhaustion etched into their faces. Alan pointed to a tall, broad-shouldered man in the center, his eyes bright with a quiet strength. "That's Raymond," Alan said, his voice softening with memory. "He was our squad's radio operator, but he was built like a tank. When our chopper crashed, he didn't hesitate. He went back into the burning wreckage 3 times to pull us out. 3 times, with flames licking at his skin, with the whole thing ready to explode. He saved us all." Evan glanced from the photograph to the old man outside, still sitting motionless in the rain. The resemblance was undeniable. The same broad shoulders, the same strong jaw. But time had carved deep lines into the man's face, stealing the vibrancy of the soldier in the photo. The figure outside seemed like a shadow of that young hero, weathered by years and secrets Evan could only imagine. "Are you sure it's him?" Evan asked, his voice soft, not wanting to challenge the man's conviction, but needing to understand. Alan nodded, his certainty unshakable. "I'd know him anywhere. We thought he died 3 days after the crash, on a reconnaissance mission. His body was never found, but we mourned him. We carried that loss for decades." He tucked the photo back into his wallet with a reverence that spoke of years spent holding on to that memory, then strode toward the door with purpose. Evan followed, his curiosity now intertwined with a growing sense of awe, as if he were witnessing something sacred unfolding in the mundane setting of a convenience store parking lot. As they approached the old man, Alan's steps slowed, his confidence faltering under the weight of emotion. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, trembling with hope and fear. Raymond Shaw?" For the first time in days, the old man's eyes moved, shifting slowly from the rain-soaked pavement to Alan's face. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or simply the spark of awareness, crossed his weathered features like a light briefly piercing the fog. Alan's breath hitched, and he took a step closer. "It's me, Alan Briggs. Do you remember?" "Lo nin machinam?" The old man's eyes narrowed, studying Alan's face with an intensity that seemed to pull him from his silent world. His lips parted, but no words came, only a faint tremor of movement. Then, with agonizing slowness, he reached into the canvas bag at his side and withdrew a small, tarnished object. Evan leaned closer and saw it was a set of military dog tags, their edges worn from years of being carried, touched, remembered. Alan's voice broke as he whispered, "You kept them all these years." Tears streamed down his face again, unheeded, as he reached out, his hand hovering just above Raymond's shoulder, afraid to break the fragile moment. "My God, Shaw, where have you been? We thought you were dead." For several minutes, Alan sat beside Raymond on the wet curb, the rain soaking through his coat as they shared a silence that spoke louder than words. Evan stood in the doorway transfixed, feeling like an intruder in a moment too profound for him to fully grasp. The world seemed to hold its breath, the rain and the hum of the store fading into the background. Eventually, the spell was broken by the crunch of tires as another customer pulled into the parking lot. Alan rose, gently helping Raymond to his feet, his movements careful as if afraid the older man might dissolve into the rain. "I'm taking him to my place tonight," Alan told Evan, his voice steady now, grounded by purpose. "Can you tell me how long he's been coming here?" Evan swallowed, still processing the weight of what he'd witnessed. "About a week," he said, "always at the same time, always just sitting there, staring." Alan nodded, his expression thoughtful, as if piecing together a puzzle. "He must have been looking for something familiar. My office is just around the corner. I stop here sometimes after working late." He glanced at Raymond, who had retreated back into his silent world, his eyes fixed on some distant point. 50 years, Alan murmured, almost to himself. 50 years, and I find him by accident. As Alan guided Raymond toward his car, he turned back to Evan, his face a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy with meaning, "for not calling the police, for giving me this chance." Evan could only nod, words failing him as he watched the two men move slowly through the rain, their silhouettes blending into the night. The weight of their reunion lingered in the air, a reminder of how a single moment, a single choice could ripple through time, binding lives across decades. The night air clung to Evan's skin, sharp and biting, but the chill that ran through him had nothing to do with the cold. Just moments ago, he'd been seconds from dialing the police, his finger hovering over the last digit, ready to report a disheveled stranger who'd wandered into his convenience store. Now, standing before him was Alan, a man whose voice trembled with gratitude and disbelief, speaking of a hero, a man who'd saved his life, a man whose selflessness had rippled through time to give Alan's children and grandchildren their existence. Evan's heart thudded in his chest, a mix of shame and awe swirling within him. He'd almost turned away a forgotten savior, a ghost of a man who'd carried the weight of his deeds in silence. The thought gnawed at him, leaving him restless as he locked up the store and headed home, replaying the near mistake in his mind. The next morning, Evan was still grappling with the weight of the previous night when the bell above the store door chimed. Alan stepped inside, his face no longer etched with the frantic urgency of the night before, but lit with a quiet determination. His clothes were dry now, his posture steadier, but his eyes held a story that hadn't yet been fully told. "I took the day off," Alan said, his voice low but firm. "Raymond stayed at my place last night. He's real, Evan. It's him." Evan leaned against the counter, his curiosity piqued, his guilt from the night before still lingering like a shadow. Alan went on, piecing together fragments of a life that had been shattered by war. Raymond, presumed dead in the jungles of Vietnam, had somehow clawed his way back to the States. But the man who returned wasn't the same one who'd left. The war had carved deep wounds into his mind, wounds that would later be called PTSD, though back then they had no name, just a crushing weight that made the world feel like an enemy. Raymond had chosen exile over burdening his family with his fractured self. He drifted through homeless shelters, lived on the streets, stayed in fleeting accommodations, always moving when the nightmares grew too loud or when curious eyes lingered too long. He'd never claimed the benefits owed to him, never sought out the camaraderie of fellow veterans. He'd simply existed, a shadow among shadows, carrying his pain alone. Evan listened, his chest tightening with each word. He imagined Raymond's solitary existence, the countless nights spent staring into the dark, haunted by memories no one else could see. The thought of it, the courage it took to keep going, to choose invisibility over pity, stirred something deep in Evan, a mix of admiration and sorrow. He wondered what he would have done in Raymond's place, if he could have borne that kind of solitude. The question lingered, unanswered, as Alan's voice trailed off, his own eyes distant with the weight of what he'd learned. Over the next few days, more of Raymond's story came to light, each piece falling into place like a puzzle long abandoned. A representative from the local Vietnam Veterans Association visited Alan's home, armed with military records that confirmed Raymond's identity. The official report of his death in action, a lie born of case and incomplete records, was struck from the books, and the slow process of restoring his benefits began. Alan's social circle buzzed with the news, and soon other veterans trickled in to meet the man who'd been a ghost for 50 years. One elderly former pilot, his hands trembling with age, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Raymond. His voice cracked with recognition. "You're the one who dragged Johnson out of that burning Huey," he said, his eyes wide with awe. "Nobody else would go near it. They wanted to pin a silver star on you, but you were already gone." The room fell silent, every pair of eyes on Raymond, who stood with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through decades of obscurity. He didn't speak, but his gaze softened, a flicker of memory passing through his eyes. Perhaps the roar of flames, the weight of a wounded man in his arms, the chaos of a moment that had defined him. Raymond's silence spoke louder than words. Evan, who'd started spending more time at Alan's place to check in, noticed how Raymond's eyes followed conversations now, how they'd occasionally brighten at the mention of a name or a long-ago event. It was as if the past, buried deep beneath layers of pain, was slowly resurfacing, fragile but real. Evan found himself wondering what Raymond saw in those moments. Did he see the faces of the men he'd saved, the jungles that had swallowed his youth, or the life he might have had if the war hadn't broken him? The questions haunted Evan, but he didn't dare ask. Instead, he watched, a quiet witness to a man reclaiming pieces of himself. A week after their reunion, Alan brought Raymond back to the convenience store. The sight of them together, Alan's protective stance, Raymond's steady but guarded presence, stirred something in Evan's chest. Alan's voice was heavy with gratitude as he spoke. "I've been thinking about what could have happened if you'd made that call to the police that night," he said, his eyes locking with Evan's. "Raymond, he's had bad run-ins with authorities before. He might have bolted, panicked, disappeared again. I might have lost him forever." Evan's throat tightened. He'd been replaying that moment too, the way his finger had lingered on the phone, the instinct to protect his store warring with the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "I almost did it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so close." Before Alan could respond, Raymond spoke, his voice rough and raw from years of disuse but clear as a bell. "The boy with the scar on his left eye," he said, his gaze fixed on Alan. Alan froze, his hand instinctively drifting to the faint scar that traced from his eyebrow to his cheekbone, a mark from a long-ago explosion. "You were trapped under the radio equipment," Raymond continued, his words slow but deliberate. "I pulled you out." Alan's breath hitched, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You remember?" he whispered. Raymond's response was soft, almost fragile. "I remember all of you, every face, every name, every night." In that moment, the decades between them dissolved. The two men embraced, their arms tight around each other, as if anchoring themselves against the tide of time and loss. Evan stood to the side, his heart pounding, feeling like an intruder yet unable to look away. He was witnessing something sacred, a reunion that had defied the odds, a moment that had almost slipped through his fingers because of a single choice. The next morning, Alan returned to the store, this time with a local reporter from the Kansas City Tribune. Patricia Winters, a woman in her 40s with a thoughtful gaze, had been skeptical when Alan first pitched the story. But the moment she met Raymond, her demeanor shifted. She leaned toward Evan as Alan and Raymond sat at a small table outside, her voice a low whisper. "There's something about him, isn't there? You can feel it, the weight he carries." Evan nodded, his eyes on Raymond's weathered face. Over the past week, he'd found himself thinking about Raymond constantly, about the quiet strength it took to survive what he had, to choose a life of anonymity rather than let his pain spill onto others. It was a kind of courage Evan hadn't known existed, and it left him humbled, forever changed by the man who'd walked into his store one cold night. As Patricia scribbled notes, Evan's thoughts drifted back to that near call to the police. He wondered how many other Raymonds were out there, invisible heroes carrying burdens no one could see. The thought settled deep in his chest, a quiet resolve taking root. He didn't know what the future held for Raymond, but he knew one thing for certain. He'd never forget the man who'd reminded him of the power of a single moment, a single choice to change everything. In the quiet hum of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall, Raymond stood clutching a crayon drawing, its bright orange flames a stark contrast to the muted grays of his memories. The room was filled with faces, veterans young and old, townsfolk, and a few reporters, but to Raymond, they blurred into a haze. His hands trembled, not from age but from the weight of a moment he'd never anticipated. 50 years of drifting, of slipping through the cracks of a world that had forgotten him, had led to this, a child's gift, a symbol of a life he'd spent saving others while running from himself. The drawing pulled him back to 1984, to a gas station engulfed in fire, the heat scorching his skin as he carried a boy to safety. He hadn't stayed to hear the family's thanks, hadn't wanted their gratitude. Back then, he'd been a shadow, a man who moved through crises like a wraith, leaving only echoes of his courage. Now, those echoes had found him, and he wasn't sure how to face them. Alan, standing a few feet away, felt his chest tighten as he watched Raymond. That rainy night at the convenience store was etched into his soul, a moment that had shifted the course of both their lives. He'd been so close to calling the police, his hand on the phone, the store's policy ringing in his ears. Raymond had been just another figure in a tattered coat, muttering softly, his eyes lost in some distant war. But something had stopped Alan, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or an instinct he couldn't name. Instead of dialing, he'd poured a cup of coffee, its steam rising like a bridge between two strangers. That choice had unraveled a story that still left him reeling. As he watched Raymond hold the drawing, Alan's mind churned with what-ifs. What if he'd made that call? Would Raymond have vanished, another ghost lost to the night? The thought was a quiet ache, a reminder of how close they'd come to missing this miracle of reunion. Patricia, the journalist whose words had set this all in motion, stood at the room's edge, her pen still for the first time in weeks. Her article had been a labor of heart and grit, born from hours spent piecing together Raymond's past with Alan's help. She'd felt the weight of every sentence, knowing she was telling a story that could change lives. The response had been staggering. Letters, calls, emails from strangers moved by Raymond's quiet heroism. But it was moments like this, with Max in his drawing, that pierced her most deeply. She thought of her father, a Vietnam vet who'd carried his own silent scars, and felt a pang of regret for the stories she'd never asked him to share. How many others, she wondered, were out there like Raymond, their sacrifices buried under years of pain and anonymity? The media had descended like a storm after her article hit the Sunday paper. By Monday, Raymond's face was everywhere, his youthful soldier's portrait from 1968 juxtaposed with the lined, weathered face of today. Stories flooded in, each one a testament to a life spent in service to others. A firefighter from Topeka recalled a stranger who'd saved his nephew from a gas station fire in 1984, vanishing before anyone could thank him. "Those eyes," he said, voice breaking. "I'd know them anywhere." A Vietnamese refugee shared memories of a silent guardian who'd protected her camp in the 1970s, his quiet vigilance a balm for frightened souls. In Minnesota, a family spoke of a man who'd plunged into a frozen pond to save their child in 1987. In Florida, relief workers remembered a tireless volunteer during a 1998 hurricane. In Colorado, hikers recounted a grizzled guide who'd led them to safety in 2005. Each story was a piece of Raymond's hidden legacy, a man who'd appeared in moments of despair and disappeared before dawn. The town rallied around him with a warmth that left Raymond bewildered. A veterans group offered him a home, a place to belong after decades of wandering. A lawyer volunteered to fight for his military benefits, determined to right the wrongs of a system that had overlooked him. At the VA, doctors approached his PTSD with care, their questions gentle as they sought to mend wounds that had festered for 50 years. Raymond, though, remained a quiet observer, speaking mostly to Alan in soft, careful words. His face held a mix of confusion and resignation, as if he couldn't quite believe the world was reaching out to him after so long. 2 weeks later, a national news segment, The Forgotten Hero, brought Raymond's story to millions. The video went viral, its raw honesty sparking a nationwide reckoning about veterans and their unseen struggles. Alan, who'd never wanted attention, found himself in the glare of the spotlight, his voice faltering as he admitted, "I almost called the police. It was policy." The words hung unfinished, heavy with the truth of how close Raymond had come to slipping away forever. The producer called it the segment's heart, a silence that spoke of fate's delicate threads. 3 weeks after their reunion, Alan arranged a ceremony at the VFW Hall. Veterans from every era gathered, their faces etched with respect as they welcomed Raymond back into their ranks. The mayor handed him a key to the city, her voice steady but her eyes bright with tears. A Pentagon official announced that Raymond's records had been corrected, and the Silver Star he'd earned in 1968 would finally be his. A congressman promised to use Raymond's story to push for better mental health care for veterans. As the event wound down, Max Peterson, an 8-year-old with his grandfather's stubborn courage, approached Raymond with his drawing. The stick figure in the flames was simple but powerful, a child's tribute to a hero. Raymond's breath caught as he took it, his fingers lingering on the paper as if it held a piece of his soul. For the first time in decades, he felt seen, not as a ghost but as a man. The fluorescent glow of the convenience store sign cast a soft, familiar light across the rain-slicked pavement, a hue that reminded Raymond Shaw of the emergency choppers from his Vietnam days, red and pulsing, a beacon in the chaos. He sat on the curb, his weathered jacket damp, his eyes tracing the neon's flicker. To the world, he was just another shadow in the city's margins, a man who'd spent decades drifting, carrying the weight of unseen scars. But to Max, a young boy with a sketch pad clutched to his chest, Raymond was something else entirely. Max approached, his sneakers splashing through puddles, and held out a drawing. "This is you," he said, his voice bright with conviction. "A real superhero, not the kind with a cape, but the kind nobody notices until they look closer." Raymond's hands trembled as he took the paper, his fingers rough from years of survival, tracing the bold lines of Max's crayon masterpiece. The drawing showed a man, not in a flashy costume, but in tattered clothes, standing tall against a stormy sky. For a long moment, Raymond said nothing, his throat tight with emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. Then, to the small crowd gathered for the community event honoring him, he did something unexpected. He knelt down to Max's level, his knees creaking, his eyes meeting the boy's. "Not a hero," he murmured, his voice low and raw, like gravel shifting underfoot. "Just a man who couldn't walk away." The words carried the weight of a life spent running, not from danger but from the ghosts of choices made in jungles and battlefields, choices that had left him wandering America's backroads for 50 years. That evening, as the community event wound down, the clink of glasses and hum of conversation fading, Alan found Evan standing alone by the refreshment table. Evan's hands were stuffed in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor, still wrestling with the moment that had changed everything. Alan, a man whose own life had been shaped by chance encounters, approached quietly. "If you hadn't been standing right there that night," Alan said, his voice thick with gratitude, "I'd have walked right past him. I'd never have known who he was." Evan's jaw tightened, the memory of that rainy night flashing vivid in his mind. The moment he'd stood over the phone, his finger hovering over the keypad, ready to call the authorities about the vagrant outside the store. "I almost made him disappear again," Evan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the guilt of what might have been. From behind them, Raymond's voice cut through the air, steady and sure. "But you didn't." Both men turned, startled to see Raymond standing there, his usual reticence replaced by a quiet resolve. "You hesitated. That was enough." Evan met Raymond's gaze, and for the first time he saw past the weathered lines of the older man's face, past the years of hardship etched into his skin. There was a fire there, a steadfast courage that had carried Raymond through decades of solitude, through nights spent under bridges and days spent invisible to the world. Evan's chest tightened with a mix of awe and shame. "Why did you sit outside our store every night?" he asked, the question burning in his mind for weeks. Raymond's lips curved into the faintest smile, a ghost of warmth in his tired eyes. "The light," he said simply. "Your store sign, it's the same color as the emergency lights on our choppers. Felt like home, somehow." The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of a man who'd spent half a century searching for something that felt like belonging. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and the air grew cooler, a documentary filmmaker approached Raymond. She was different from the news crews who'd hounded him for sound bites, their cameras hungry for sensationalism. Her eyes were earnest, her voice gentle as she pitched her idea. A film that wouldn't just focus on the dramatic rescues that had brought Raymond's story to light, but on the quiet, grinding struggle of a man carrying the invisible wounds of war through a country that had changed around him. She wanted to tell the story of his life after Vietnam, the lonely nights, the small acts of kindness he'd offered to others even when he had nothing, the way he'd kept moving forward despite the nightmares that never quite left. To everyone's surprise, Raymond agreed, but with a condition that came from deep within his core. "Tell it true," he said, his voice firm. "Not just about me, but about all the forgotten ones still out there." His words were a plea, not for himself, but for the countless others like him. Veterans lost in the shadows, too proud or too broken to ask for help. The documentary, The Quiet Ones, became more than a film. It was a revelation, a raw and unflinching look at the cost of war and the resilience of those who carried its burdens. It won awards, but more importantly, it sparked a movement. Across America, outreach programs sprang up in cities large and small, designed to find those like Raymond, men and women who slipped through the cracks, whose pride or trauma kept them from seeking aid. These programs weren't just about shelter or food. They were about connection, about recognizing the humanity in those the world had overlooked. For Raymond, the film was a mirror, reflecting a life he'd never fully understood himself. Watching it, he felt the sting of old wounds, but also a quiet pride, not in his own survival, but in the lives his story was beginning to touch. For Evan, that moment of hesitation by the phone had rewritten his future. The weight of it, the what-ifs and the almosts, pushed him to change his path. He abandoned his business major at the community college, trading it for social work with a focus on veteran services. The scholarship fund established in Raymond's name became his lifeline, eventually funding his bachelor's degree. In his graduation speech years later, he stood before a crowd, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Some people find their calling in dramatic ways," he said. "Mine came in the moment I chose not to make a phone call." That choice, that fleeting pause, had rippled outward, reshaping not just his life, but the lives of countless others. Raymond, for the first time in 50 years, found a place to call home. The veterans' residential facility wasn't just a building, it was a community that saw him, not as a hero or a victim, but as a man who'd fought battles both on the battlefield and within himself. The nightmares didn't vanish. Some wounds were too deep, too jagged to ever fully heal. But they were tempered now by days filled with purpose, speaking to outreach workers, sharing his story with those who needed to hear it, and finding solace in the small human connections that had eluded him for so long. His apartment in the veterans community was modest, but it was his. The once bare walls now held memories, a faded photo of his Vietnam squad, their smiles defiant against the jungle's heat, a snapshot of Alan with his sprawling family at a barbecue, laughter frozen in time, and most unexpectedly, Max's drawing, framed and hung with care, a reminder of the boy who'd seen what others hadn't. 6 months after that rainy night, Raymond sat with Alan on the porch of the veterans facility, the evening air cool against their skin. They didn't speak much. Words had never been Raymond's strength. Instead, they sat in the kind of silence that only comes between men who've seen the world's cruelty and its kindness in equal measure. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, and Alan broke the quiet. "You know," he said, his voice soft but deliberate, "I've spent 50 years wondering why I survived when so many didn't. Now I think maybe it was for this, to be in that store that night, to recognize you, to bring you home." Raymond's eyes stayed on the horizon, his face unreadable, but his heart heavy with the weight of Alan's words. He nodded just slightly. "Maybe," he said, his voice barely audible. "Or maybe it was so that boy wouldn't make that call." The words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the fragile, beautiful chain of moments that had led them here, a chain forged by hesitation, recognition, and the courage to see someone who'd been invisible for too long. The summer sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the backyard barbecue, where laughter and the sizzle of burgers filled the air. Amid the clinking glasses and casual chatter, a photograph circulated among the guests, a candid snapshot of Evan, frozen in time behind the convenience store counter. His eyes, wide with a flicker of uncertainty, met the camera in a moment so raw it seemed to pulse with life. That single frame captured something deeper than hesitation. It was the quiet dawning of a truth he hadn't yet fully grasped. Evan's heart, in that instant, had been wrestling with the weight of judgment, a reflex he'd later come to regret. The photo, now passed from hand to hand, stirred a pang in his chest, a reminder of how close he'd come to missing the man who would change his life. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, Evan would arrive at Raymond's modest apartment, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, no sugar, just the way Raymond liked it. What began as a polite gesture, a small act of atonement for that rainy night when Evan had misjudged the weathered stranger, had blossomed into something sacred. The ritual anchored them both. For Evan, it was a chance to listen, to absorb the quiet wisdom of a man who spoke little but carried a lifetime in his eyes. For Raymond, it was a tether to a world he'd long drifted through alone, a reminder that someone saw him, not as a shadow, but as a man. Some mornings Ellen would join them, his arms laden with a box of donuts, his voice brimming with updates about the Veterans Network that had rallied around Raymond's story. Those gatherings, simple as they were, wove a thread of connection through their lives, each man finding solace in the other's presence. At the convenience store, the spot where Raymond had sat that stormy night was no longer just a corner by the window. A small brass plaque now marked it, its inscription simple yet profound, in honor of Raymond Shaw. The store owner, a gruff man softened by the story of Raymond's quiet heroism, had gone further. He'd installed a sturdy wooden bench outside, its backrest engraved with an open invitation. Any veteran in need of rest would find a welcome here. Evan passed that bench every day, and each time his gaze lingered on the words. They felt like a promise he'd made to himself, to never again let first impressions blind him to the truth. Behind the counter, another tribute stood, a framed photograph of Raymond and Alan locked in an embrace, their faces alight with a joy that spoke of reunion and redemption. For Evan and his co-workers, it was a daily sermon in humility, a silent vow to look beyond the surface. Some days, Evan would catch himself staring at the photo, his mind replaying that night, wondering how he'd failed to see the legend sitting right in front of him. Raymond rarely spoke of the decades he'd spent wandering, his life a tapestry of solitary roads and fleeting encounters. But when he did share, his words were like fragments of a mosaic, each one revealing a man who had never stopped giving, even when the world had turned its back on him. One evening over coffee, he mentioned a winter night spent sharing his last blanket with a stranger in an alley. Another time, he spoke of a small town where he'd fixed a widow's leaking roof, slipping away before she could thank him. These stories, offered without pride, left Evan and Alan in quiet awe. Raymond's life hadn't been one of grand gestures, but of countless small acts, each one a ripple of kindness in a world that had often shown him none. To Raymond, those years weren't a burden, but a calling, a path he'd walked because someone had to. Across town, a fifth-grade girl named Lily sat in her classroom, her pencil dancing across the page as she poured her heart into an essay. She'd never met Raymond, but his story had reached her through a teacher who'd shared it during a lesson on compassion. Titled "Real Heroes Don't Need Their Names Known," her essay wove a vivid portrait of a man whose quiet courage had reshaped a community. Lily wrote of the invisible people, the ones who passed unnoticed on street corners or in crowded stores, and how Raymond's life had taught her to see them differently. Her words, earnest and unflinching, struck a chord far beyond her small town, earning her first place in a state contest. When her essay was read aloud at a school assembly, her classmates sat in rapt silence, their young minds grappling with the idea that heroes might walk among them, hidden in plain sight. For Lily, Raymond's story was a lens, sharpening her view of the world and igniting a spark of empathy she'd carry for years to come. One crisp afternoon, a journalist cornered Raymond outside the residential facility where he now lived, her notepad ready, her questions relentless. Did he regret the years spent alone, drifting from town to town, Unseen and uncelebrated? Raymond paused, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, his gaze steady. A faint smile crossed his lips as he shook his head. I was where I needed to be, he said, his voice low but firm. Sometimes the best place to help is in the shadows. The journalist pressed further, but Raymond's answer remained unchanged, a quiet defiance in his refusal to see his life as anything less than purposeful. To him, those years weren't lost. They were spent in service, in the places where light rarely reached. His words lingered in the air, a testament to a man who had found meaning in the margins. On Veterans Day, the courtyard of the residential facility buzzed with a small but earnest crowd. Veterans, neighbors, and a few curious passers-by. Raymond stood at the center, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands gripping a single note card. Public speaking was foreign to him, a man who'd spent decades dodging the spotlight. Yet there he was, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each word. A hero doesn't need medals, he began, his eyes sweeping the faces before him. They just need someone who remembers them. His gaze found Evan in the crowd, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. You may not know who they are, Raymond continued, but they once saved the world. The words landed like a gentle wave, washing over the listeners and leaving a hush in their wake. Evan felt his throat tighten, a mix of gratitude and guilt swirling in his chest. Raymond's speech, brief as it was, carried the weight of a lifetime, its message etched into the hearts of those who heard it. Later, Raymond's final words from that day would be carved into the memorial bench outside the convenience store, a quiet monument to his legacy. Be careful how you look at people, because sometimes you're looking at a legend without knowing it. Below, another line was added, a nod to the man's unshakable faith. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. For Evan, those words were a daily reminder to persevere, to hold fast to what was right even when the world seemed to turn away. As he locked up the store each night, his eyes would drift to the bench, and he'd think of Raymond, not just the man he'd met, but the countless others like him, their stories waiting to be seen. In those quiet moments, Evan vowed to keep looking, to never let another legend pass him by unnoticed.